Alright guys, today we're working on this 2009 Chevrolet Cobalt LS 4-door sedan's rear drum brakes. And it started off as a noise. When we came back here to inspect this, I'll show you what we found. You want to make sure you've released the parking brake. This might be on a lot harder than it currently is when you have this kind of a problem. Since we already had it off once, it's not coming off too bad. So we sprayed this down. Normally this would be covered with brake dust. But the problem that we're looking at is if you see on the inside of the drum here, when you zoom in here, it's scored. Several deep grooves cut into the actual drum. So we're going to see if we can take it down to the machine shop and get them to turn it and see if we can save this drum and reuse it. What the machine shop will do is they will reference this specification on the outside of this GM drum, 230.6 millimeters. They'll try to see if they can turn this down and still stay within the specification. Otherwise, we'll have to replace this drum. And if we have to replace this drum, we're going to have to replace the one on the other side because you do them in pairs, even though the one on the other side doesn't have this particular problem. The other thing we can see with this is if we come up and examine the shoes, I think this one here shows it easiest. You look at the shoes. There's a groove cut into the shoes that matches the groove cut into the drum on this side. I don't feel it as bad on this side, but you can still see it. So I think what happened here is something got inside and scraped around and cut through this. Now, some places will tell you you could sand these shoes off. I'm going to tell you you shouldn't do that. If you get any kind of defect like this, you replace the shoes. So that's what we'll be doing. We'll replace the shoes and we'll go ahead and freshen up the spring hardware as well. But first we got to see if the machine shop can save our drums. So let me run that over there and see where we go with the drums. Then we'll continue with this shoe swap out job. Alright guys, let's take a look at the service manual to see what's involved with this job. So we're going to look at the 2009 A-Car service manual that covers the Cobalt and the G5 from Pontiac. And we're going to go over here to the drum brake section. And there's a couple of things I'll call out here. So I was mentioning earlier about the writing that's on the outside of the drums. That's the discard diameter, right? So that's as far as it can go, maximum, before you discard it. And just in comparison, a brand new one. So you have to discard it at 230.6 millimeters. A brand new one is 228.6 plus or minus 0.01. And you measure this inside. So when you take it to the machine shop, they're going to use a drum caliper to measure whether this is something that can be salvaged or not. And then if it is, they'll turn it. Now we got ours back from the machine shop. I'll show you that in a minute. And we got that groove ground out of it, and we still got enough for one more turn after that. So that's one thing that they're going to check and make sure. And if they can't reuse it, if it's past the maximum, then you got to get new drums. So the machine shop will take care of all this inspection in our case. If they didn't, the service manual will talk about going through and checking this. So if you weren't taking it to the machine shop, you're looking for rust and pitting on the braking surface. It's okay to have surface corrosion all over the outer area, but there shouldn't be any where the shoes are rubbing. You're looking for cracks and, most importantly, heat spots. You can see this excessive bluing. It's a bluing of the metal on the inside. I'll show where you'd look for it in a minute. Is going to affect whether or not you'd keep the brake drum or toss it. All right, and so then over here they also are talking about skipping past this measurement where you'd need special equipment to do that. They're also trying you to check the scoring depth, and they have a specification for that as well. And again, the machine shop is the best place to have this done. Don't take it to like your neighborhood parts store if it's a chain. If it's an independent, it's probably okay. But independent shop or a machine shop, not the chain places, because where you're just going to get somebody that's who's ever on minimum wage doing this kind of work. You don't want that. All right, so I'll just let you see that here. There's a bunch more checks, but again, let the machine shop deal with all this. Then we start talking about inspecting the brake drum hardware. So that's what we're going to get into now. Basically, you got all these springs in positions 1, 2, 3 with a cap on it and a pin in position 4. And for each one, we're going to check and see if it's got excessive corrosion. Surface corrosion is normal. Pitting is bad. Stretching, where when you take the spring off, it stays stretched out, and the best way to compare that, and I'll show you, is to have a new set on hand so you can tell if the spring's broken or if it's actually missing. If anything fails, it all gets replaced. So any one of these pieces fails, the whole thing gets replaced. But anyway, they just have you go through each one doing the same exact checks as far as stretching, bending, corrosion, broken, or missing. Now they make a comment about brake dust warning. I'll show you that real quick here in the front. But basically, this is why I said earlier, you do not grind brake linings, you do not sand brake linings, and you only clean it. You do not clean it with a dry brush or compressed air. You only clean it with brake clean, which is a liquid. That's because the dust from these things, depending on who the manufacturer is, can have asbestos in it, and that obviously is a cancer causer, super cancer causer. So that's why we're not going to just try to sand out those grooves on those shoes. We're just going to toss them and replace them. So what we're going to be doing is skipping ahead past these inspections, and we're going to be going to brake shoe replacement. So if our hardware is good, all we got to do is swap out the shoes. And replacing the brake shoes just means removing these pieces in this order. So we're going to take off, after we take the drum off, of course, we're going to remove the brake adjuster actuator lever spring, which is this guy on the left, and that'll allow us to take off the brake adjuster actuator. This is the thing that keeps the shoes pushed up properly to the drum. Every time you back up, this thing gives a click, if necessary, to keep that adjusted. Then we're going to remove the hold down spring and cup assemblies from here, and then there's a pin that comes through from the backing plate on the back that's held in by the top of this. I'll show that to you when we get there. We're going to move that. That'll allow us to move the shoes out apart and remove the brake shoe adjuster that sits between the two of them. And all the while we're doing this, we're going to again check all these components for rust, damage, cracks, scoring, that sort of thing. Then we're going to remove the upper brake shoe return spring. There's no special tools with this. You know, these are bonded shoes, so you can't really use brake shoe pliers, but there is a tool you can use to get these cups off, and then the best tool for the springs is just a set of long nose pliers or long nose vice grips. Since if you had riveted shoes, you could use a brake shoe spring, but not with bonded. After we remove the return spring, then we can start to remove the shoes themselves. So they start with the primary shoe, so that we can then get the lower spring released. After we get the one shoe released from the lower spring, we'll be able to remove the spring from the other shoe, and then we can take the trailing shoe off, and that's it. And then we're just going to reverse this whole thing in the opposite order to install it, right? And then there's no torques or anything like that. The last thing after we get everything put on is to readjust the distance from the shoes to the drum. So let's take a look at those drums from the machine shop. All right, guys, so I put a swab of yellow paint on our driver's side drum here. As you can see, we've got this all machined off, no grooves anymore, perfectly smooth other than the smudge I made when I picked it up. And then here's our passenger side. Same deal, all ready to go. Now basically, you know, they put this on a lathe machine mounted to the lug holes, calibrated to the amount of material they're going to remove, and they take it off and spin it, and that's how it does this. All right, so these drums we're reusing. They came out great. Now we're going to start doing this hardware, right? So what they talked about removing first was this spring over here. And it's getting kind of overcast, so I don't know if you guys can see. We're going to use this long nose vice grip to take that spring off, and that'll take our adjuster off. And just take note of where this stuff goes if you're not used to this particular model. Get my release going here. Right, this goes on this pin here. So you want to take note of where this went, and then it goes up against those teeth. And then the short end goes on the adjuster, and the long end goes on the shoe. And I might skip out of order from the service manual, but it's basically going to be the same thing. All right, so these cups, you can see there's like a little plus here. The pin comes through, and it sits in these recesses. We're going to push it in and twist it so that it can come through. If we can see without any light here. cup comes off the end, then the spring, and then the pin will come out the back. It'll have a flat end on it, and then you're trying to compress it to get it like that, and that's what holds it all together. So this is fine and perfect. There's no corrosion on this guy at all. There's no corrosion on this guy at all. This pin's got some surface corrosion. What I'm more concerned about the pin, though, is it's bent. If you can notice that. But this pin's a little bent. So let's see what the other one looks like. We might decide to replace all this just because of that. That's how fast it's supposed to come off. Yeah, so this one's rusty on the surface too, but he's not bent. So I don't know. Haven't decided yet. We'll have to see how far we get with everything else. All right, so now we should be able to pull this guy apart enough to get in here and grab this spring. And then we can take our adjuster off. We're just going to leave this spring attached. This one comes off. Then we can remove that spring. Now this is still attached to the parking brake. Come up here and remove this spring from the back of that. Just going to let that sit there for just a second while we go and take a look at these other springs and see how they are. So this guy's not stretched out. You can even still see the inspection paint mark on it from the factory. Just a lot of dust on it. He's fine. This guy's even in better shape. He still looks brand new. Still has the black paint on him. So out of all of our hardware, all we really have is this pin slightly bent, and the pins have some corrosion on them. Now you can compare, like I was mentioning, to a new set. We've got a couple of packs over here. The driver's side that we're on here now is a 2596-0266 from GM, and that's all those pieces that you just saw there. And then the passenger side would be a 2596-0265, so just a difference of one number. Basically the same deal. I don't know why this one's in such a larger package than the other one, but that's all it is. Each side is different and unique. And these parts, by the time you see this video, are probably going to be discontinued because a lot of this Cobalt stuff is heading in that direction. But this is what I was mentioning. You can use the new one if you want to try and figure out if the spring is stretched. And you can compare your original one to the one in the package to see that, you know, it's one coil may be different. And that's just a manufacturing difference. The length is the same. Right? So the length's the same. Sometimes the manufacturing process of making these springs, you can end up with an extra coil. And then the lower spring we can compare with the one we have in the kit here. Same deal. It looks identical. And the pins obviously are supposed to be plated and straight, and ours are bent. So in the grand scheme of things, since I think the pins should be replaced, we'll just go ahead and use all this new hardware. Alright, so last thing is we got to get the parking brake piece off, but before I do that, let me reach over here and show you the shoes. So the shoes come in a kit. It's GM part number 2596-0262, or an AC Delco 171-1085. And what's going to be in here are just 2 secondaries and 2 primary shoes individually wrapped. Right, so the leading ones are not going to have the parking brake attachment. All right, so each side is going to be marked correctly, so you can see that's got a big L stamped in it on this one. I didn't show that earlier, but the other one has got a big R stamped in it for left and right side. So you can't screw it up. And then the primary ones are identical. So if we take this guy out, right, so these are bonded, no rivets, and no raised grooves cut into it like ours have, right? So let's get this parking brake piece off and then just reverse everything, put it back together. All right, guys, the last part of the disassembly, they actually don't even show in the service manual, and that's releasing this parking brake cable. We're just going to work it off. It's just going right around behind a bracket here. If we just trying to get it off on the other side so we have some more room. All right, I'm going to take our long nose vice grip pliers. And we're just going to pull the tension off of this cable so that we can get it out of that little groove. And with that, we have disassembled the rear drum brake. Now we're just ready to reverse it all with our new hardware. All right, so let's start replacing our hardware so we don't get it all mixed up. So again, make sure you've got the side that you're working on. So we're on the left-hand side of the vehicle. The driver's side is the left-hand side. All right, so we're going to take that spring, replace it, that cup, replace it, that pin, replace it. Same thing over here, this cup, this spring, and this bent pin. Take our long spring and replace that. Bottom spring, replace that. And then the last piece that's in the kit is this spring here. It goes on our adjuster. So now we've got all new gear. But we're not ready to start yet, and I guess we'll go ahead and we'll take our front primary shoe. And here's our rear shoe. I don't know if you could see this well with the plastic on before. There's the L I was talking about, and the other one's going to have an R. Right, so we'll end up having this face the other side. I don't think the original ones, this is the original one from the factory in 2009. It doesn't have any markings at all. They just had to know which one to put on by how they looked. And you can tell them apart. All right, let's go ahead and start with this piece here. So this guy, he's going to sit like that. What I'm going to do, just so we don't accidentally rub the shoe on the ground, put the plastic bag back on it. And we're just going to stretch this guy back out and put him back on. Easier to get off than on. Trying to do is just get this spring up against the back lip, and then it'll go. There we go. All right. So you keep the plastic on here, so if you accidentally are working close to the ground like we are here, you don't want to rub the shoe in the concrete. All right, we're going to put this cable back above that little bracket the way we found it. All right, so this guy is back where he needs to be. And before we start putting the rest of it together, we need to go in here and clean this guy out. It's got a little bit of a corrosion on it, and then we're going to put a little bit of brake grease on there before we put it back together, and then we're going to use this to adjust our shoes. So that'll be the last step. Let's go ahead and clean this off. Alright guys, we're going to take our long spring, we're going to run it through this back hole here. Bring it up. This shape here is specifically so that that spring doesn't grab. Alright, and we're going to let that lay up there. We're going to take this pin, run it through the backing plate, through the shoe. Going to put our finger back there to hold it. Going to put our spring on. Take one of our cups. And it's just a matter of lining this guy up and then give him a twist. Got to get him where he's going to go in first. There he goes. All right. He's a little bit crooked. I don't like him. Right on the middle there. All right, and now we can run the lower spring in to that hole, and then we'll let this sit until we can bring our adjuster back in. All right, all we're going to use to clean this is steel wool. Most of what we're looking at here is probably just brake dust, but there also could be some light surface corrosion if anything has worn through the plating and it's down to the bare steel. But we want to get all of this off of there as best we can anyway. And we can see here the plating is actually corroded through right on this end here. And that's okay. It's not something that we're going to replace it on. We would replace it if it was deeply pitted. Surface corrosion is purely cosmetic, not functional. After we get done with this step, we're going to blow this out in case we got any of these little steel fibers inside this channel in the middle. That's what we're trying to do, is get this as shiny as we can. And similarly on this one, just trying to get it as shiny as we can. Then we'll go on wire wheel off. It's a little bit easier to get a wire wheel on the adjuster nut here and on the threads. And then after we get ready to put it all back together, this piece is not threaded. The way this works is the adjuster moves this nut, and that lets this guy either expand, or if you're adjusting it for the first time, you can do it manually, you can decrease it. And this in here just needs to be lubricated. Right, the service manual mentioned the high temperature grease. I'll show you the AC Delco grease we're using for that when we get ready to mount it. All right, again, back to the service manual as we get all these pieces reinstalled. A couple of lubrication points, light coat of high temperature brake lubricant to the brake shoe adjuster screw threads. So I'll show you that. While you've got the lubricant out, after you get everything, either before you get everything reassembled, but I prefer to do it after everything's reassembled. There's also a point about applying a coat of that same high temperature lubricant to the backing plate shoe contact surfaces. All along the side here, you can see these raised ones in this diagram here, here, and then there's a couple on the other side. This picture here shows them pretty good here, here, and here. There's basically 3 on each side. That also gets a light coat of lubricant, so I'll show you that as well. All right, so we have a break in the overcast, so hopefully you guys have some better light now. So we've got our adjuster all cleaned up. This is the lubricant we're going to be using, AC Delco silicone brake lubricant, AC Delco 104019 or GM 8886 2182. We only need to put this on the threads. We don't need a lot. Right, so that's just so that this moves nice and easily. And then we're going to work this adjuster down onto it as well. so that those threads get coated with it as well. Just want to put a little bit right there and walk it back up in the other direction. This type of nut is designed to be pushed by the adjuster. All right, now we're going to take our leading shoe, hole here, bottom spring in there. There's this plate here, right down here on the bottom. We're going to get it behind that, stretch the lower spring, and get it up against the top of the wheel cylinder. Now we got to get this back spring in, and then we got to get the adjuster in. I'm going to bungee this into place just to hold it while we're working on this. We are going to grab our adjuster and have it handy, but we're not going to put that on just yet. We've got our pin, spring, and cup for this side, but we're not going to put that on just yet. But we can't find our, there we need our vice grip pliers, and we're going to need some goggles for this spring. All right, pull this guy out where we can grab him. All right, he's going to have to go in this second hole right here. Let's see if I can get this with enough leverage with you guys there. I might have to get on the side where the camera is. As this is a new spring, it is super tight. Tiger tight. There we go. All right. Now with that guy on, we'll go ahead and we'll run our adjuster all the way down. The thin side's going to go in here. This will help get the lubricant on there anyway, so we don't have to stretch it too far to get this in. Trying to decide which one is going to be easier to pull on. Now the service manual talks to you about putting this on first and then the spring, but that is a bear to do. All right, we got one more pin on this side. One more spring. One more cup. Tool where we can see in the little window here. Keep your finger back in the back to keep the pin from moving. And now everything is reinstalled. So now, all right, guys, when we had this at the machine shop, they would have coated this with a rust preventative. So before we start rubbing this guy up on the drums, excuse me, on the shoes, we're going to brake clean all that off. All right, guys, and like I showed you in that service manual page, just like the same material that we used on the adjuster, we're going to put on the backing plate pads. I like to use a little popsicle stick for this because the applicator that's built into the can is way too large for this. So all I do is I go back in, I pull it back, and this way I'm sure that I'm getting it on the piece that actually rubs on this. Right? So I'm going to do that here, I'm going to do that here. I'm going to pull it back and do it down here, and on that we're going to do all 6 of them. We're just going to use our brake shoe spoon to pull our shoe back enough to lubricate that one here. Always make sure you grab it on the metal side so you don't damage the braking material. All right, guys, we've got everything mounted except for our adjuster because we're going to do some adjustments first. Let me show you before I get started on that how this parking brake fits in here. I don't know if there was enough light earlier when it was cloudier. right? But the cable routes into that bracket that you see right here. We lifted it out of there and pulled it down to both remove it and reattach it, but you got to make sure you put it back in there when you're done. And then on the other side, if we swing the camera over this way, there's a little bracket on this side too. I want to make sure it's routed properly on that side as well. All right, now to do our adjustment. Since we got almost all the hardware on, we're going to get the wheel cylinder shifted over. If it's squished in too far on one side like that, you can see it can move. We want to get it centered. Just like that. All right, so the pistons on both sides of the wheel cylinder look about equidistant. And then we can try to start adjusting the spacing of the shoes to the drum. So this is obviously going to be a lot of slack because we compressed it all the way to fit this guy in after we got that spring on. So now we're going to take a brake shoe spoon. If you don't have one, you can use whatever tool you have handy. And we're going to start opening this up. Basically, we're simulating what the adjuster would do. If I turned it in the right direction, it's really meant to come in from the back. There's a little port that you can go in and get a tool like this in here. But as we do this, you can see the threads are increasing on this side. So this nut, just widen this out. We're just going to keep checking this. So it's starting to get tighter, right? It's still not tight enough. We're going to keep going until we can't get it on. So I'm going to keep going with this and I'll come back and show you where we landed. But like you can see right now, I've gotten it where I can't get the drum on, so it's too far. So now we're just going to slowly back it up. I guess I'll just have you watch this. So turn it to 1, 2, nope, 3, 4, nope, 5, 6, nope, so that's a lot of friction. So now we're getting close. So now we'll go slower. 1 tooth. It's almost where I would want it. We'll do one more tooth. And then we can let the adjuster take it over from there. That's good. So remember, it's 15 thousandths of an inch between the surface of the shoe and the braking surface. 15 thousandths is all it needs. So that's probably close enough. So let's put our adjuster back on. All right, so we got our new spring on there. There is a notch on the top here, right in the back. See that notch right there? And then this pin. And this guy is going to go up into that notch and on this pin. Just like that. Small end of the spring is going to go in this little hole right there. And we're going to go grab our ever elusive long nose vice grips and our goggles. And we're going to bring this spring down into that hole right there. It's an easy one. And now it's in position. So now what's going to happen is during normal braking of the vehicle, this shoe is going to work this lever to turn that one click if it can. And it only can if the gap is not at least that specification of a 15,000th of an inch between here and the drum. Otherwise it won't be able to move and it won't do anything and the spring will take up the slack. All right, now all we have to do is give this guy a hosing down with brake clean. Let me get out of the way here. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to wire wheel around this hub area and on this surface facing area to get some of this corrosion off while we're in here. All right, so here's a view on the other side here of all this equipment close up and how it fits in and sits, spring on shoe. So we just want to get this back down to bare steel. Similarly on this hub. We're going to get this worked down as best we can back down to bare steel so these two don't stick together. Most importantly, we're going to go around this snout and get all of that off. All right, guys, now we're just going to give it one more hose down with brake clean just to get our surface oils off of the shoe surface and anything else we've touched. Let that dry and we'll be ready to reassemble it. All right, everything's dried off. We got this sanded out very nicely on the inside drum. We got as much as we could on this bearing. We're just going to put a little bit of sealant on here to keep it from sticking. This is just fluid film. It works great for this kind of purpose. And we are done with the driver's side. All right, so now we're going to go do the, put the wheel back on and we'll go do the passenger side. I'm not going to show the entire passenger side, but I'll show the differences with the driver's side. All right, so guys, on the passenger side, we don't have any of that scoring on the shoes and we don't have any damage on the drum. We went ahead and turned the drum at the machine shop anyway so that they're uniform in their dimensions. And even though this side doesn't have any problems, we put shoes on in pairs. So we're going to take this off anyway. I'm not going to show this whole thing because it's just the reverse of what we did on the other side. But what I'll do when I get all this hardware off is I'll show you the differences between the hardware on this side, on the passenger side, from the driver's side, on the left-hand side. I'm just going to put our parking brake back on. So this is different, of course. This is the right-hand side. So it's stamped an R. Remember on the driver's side it was stamped with an L. So that's one difference on this piece. All right, guys, so another thing that's different on the passenger side is the adjuster itself. Obviously, this nut has to turn in a certain direction, pulled down by the adjuster lever. And so while the pieces individually look the same from both sides, they're threaded differently. So there's going to be two different part numbers, a left and a right-hand side for this piece as well. So the unique items are the adjuster bar here, as well as the rear shoes. The front shoes are the same, and a lot of this other stuff is going to look the same, although these spring kits do come in two different numbers, and we'll go through and compare those in a bit. The other thing I want to show you on here is be sure, like I mentioned earlier, that you get all 6 of the shoe rub points on the backing plate lubricated, as well as the threads on the adjuster. And we use that AC Delco high temperature brake lubricant. You want to use something like that that won't melt and end up getting on the braking surface itself. These cups and these springs and these pins are identical for both sides. All 4 of these are the same. This lower spring that we put on down here, and if we come down here, just remember these lower shoes have to sit behind this plate down here like you see. And we want to make sure that the parking brake is going into this little bracket, probably easier just to show you the mirror here, this little bracket that you see right there. And this spring that goes in the back goes on this second hole furthest away from the other end. And then the spring that holds the adjuster goes on this hole right there. Now when you look at the pieces, these are the pieces that we took off this side. So we didn't have, we had a bent pin on this side as well, and again in the front. Don't know if that's a common thing to these models or what. There's our bottom spring, there's our adjuster spring, and there's our primary spring. And if we take a look at the parts we took off the other side and we'd put them in the other bag, you can see that there's really no difference, even though they sell these as left and right side, right? So here is the left-hand side lower spring. Looks identical to the one we took off. Here's the left-hand side mainspring. Looks identical to the one we took off. Here's the left-hand side adjuster spring. And then, of course, we take these pieces here out. There's no difference on these cups on the other side either. So I'm not really sure why GM has a separate part number for each side, with a 266 being for the driver's side and a 265 being for the passenger side, when the parts look identical. And since these parts are discontinued by the time you see this video, that's a good tip to know that if you only need one, if you can find either, you should be okay, because from my experience right here live, they're identical. I can't find anything different. The only possible thing I could think is, maybe if there's some kind of difference in the spring tension, but I seriously doubt there's any difference like that just between two different sides. All right, so one other thing we'll show close up here is how this little tensioner works. So you can see as this shoe would be activated and this spring pulled down, you can see there's a little tooth on this guy. If we zoom in there, you can see that tiny little tooth click onto that ridge of that nut. And what he would normally do is he would grab that and pull it down just like I did with the spoon when you go in a reverse direction. And that's how it automatically adjusts itself. All right, guys, that's it. We're all done. Everything's put in. Our adjuster's adjusted as far as we can get it manually, just like we did on the driver's side. And again, what you want to do as a final set of adjustments is you want to back up out of your driveway a few times. And those rear stops will do the final dialing in of this mechanism and get you to the point where you've got it where you want it to be. You'll have to do that final dial in order for the parking brake to grab correctly, too. If you do that whole dial in, and your brakes are otherwise working okay, but the parking brake's not holding well, then that could mean that the parking brake cable is either out of adjustment or has some kind of damage to it. You want to check that separately. All right, that's it, guys. This is, like I said earlier, it's a 2009 Chevrolet Cobalt. This style of brake in the drum changed in 2009. So while a lot of what I showed you might look similar for a 2005 to 2008 Cobalt or Pontiac G5, it's not the same parts. These are different parts. These parts I used in this video only cover 2009 for the G5 from Pontiac and the Cobalt, as well as 2010 for the Cobalt, and then it covers also the Chevrolet HHR 2009 through 2011. If you got questions or comments about what we did today, leave it down below in the comments and I'll try to help. If you found this video saved you some money and helped you get this job done yourself, go ahead and hit that like button for me and pay it forward. And as always, thanks for watching.